So Britain's main opposition, the Labour Party, has won the country's general elections, crossing the 326 seat threshold for a working majority in the House of Commons. The result ends a 14 years of Conservative government, which has seen 5 different prime ministers running the country. In his victory speech, Sir Keir Starmer promised national renewal and the country first, party second.
We did it! You campaigned for it, you fought for it, you voted for it, and now it has arrived. Change begins now. 4.5 years of work changing the party. This is what it is for. A changed Labour Party, ready to serve our country, ready to restore Britain to the service of working people.
An outgoing Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, conceded that the Labour had won. He says that he called Keir Starmer to congratulate him.
The Labour Party has won this general election, and I have called Sir Keir Starmer to congratulate him on his victory. Today, power will change hands in a peaceful and orderly manner, with goodwill on all sides. That is something that should give us all confidence in our country's stability and future. The British people have delivered a sobering verdict.
For more on this, let's now bring in political analyst Musa Mdunge, based at the University of Dundee in the UK. Musa, very good morning to you. Thank you so much for making time for us. Geez, it seems like such a distant memory since the last time that the Labour Party had a Prime Minister. Who still remembers Tony Blair?
Thank you so much, Eldrin, to you and to your viewers. Certainly, you're quite correct. It is, a result in a generation. If you think about it, that the median age in the UK is 41, and you would have needed to be 45 and above to have had the last experience or participation in an election where the Labour Party won. And so definitely this is seismic, given what it represents in the time that we're in, where we see in mainland Europe parties sort of moving towards the right of center, with far-right parties being very successful. In this election, it's a story of two kinds here. On the one hand, you have the Labour Party, which has been able to turn around from a 202 seat holding that they had in 2019 to more than double that, basically, in this election, shows somewhat that there is some appetite for the center to still hold. But at the same time, what you see with what happened with the entrance of the Reform Party, as led by Nigel Farage, who also himself managed on the 8th attempt to win a seat himself, shows that this vote must be characterized as an anti-conservative vote more than a pro-Labour vote. And this is born out of the fact that Labour only managed to get 33% share of the total number of votes, which is even lower than in 2019 and far lower than in 1997, their last seismic victory against the Conservative Party.
Yeah, did Rishi Sunak underestimate what could play out here, considering that he called for that snap poll? Some people say that they didn't expect it. Or was this basically him trying to find a way out?
I think this was always going to be a difficult election for Rishi Sunak, regardless of when he would have hosted it, given the kind of consistent economic data that continue to show that the UK continues to struggle economically to recover post-COVID-19. Secondly, yes, there were improved inflation numbers, which Rishi Sunak could hopefully have pointed to, but unfortunately too little too late. And then thirdly, his flagship policy, which was around the Rwanda asylum agreement, that hasn't found expression yet. There's been a lot of hurdles in terms of that and the manner in which the United Kingdom was being positioned. But of course, like in the case as it was in South Africa, the entrance of the MK party being very impactful in terms of the election results against the ANC. Same can be said here in the United Kingdom, that the entrance of the Reform Party, which in many constituencies, in many seats, managed to be the number 2, if not the number 3 party. And in many ways, when you would calculate and combine the number of votes won by a candidate from the Conservative Party with that of the Reform candidate, in most cases, they outdid the Labour candidate. And so that's telling for both the Conservative Party and for Rishi Sunak, who now, as much as he has won his seat, he faces a parliamentary party that will really be hounding for his blood, particularly if you consider that about 11 ministers have lost their jobs, lost their seats, including the former Prime Minister Liz Truss, including the former Prime Minister Theresa May, even though she resigned her seat. But it's the fact that seats of even Prime Ministers, even Boris Johnson's own former seat, switched hands to the Conservative, to the Labour Party. So in many ways, this has been a disastrous election for Rishi Sunak, one that will be hard for him to really march a defense for and convince his party that he's the man to lead the rebuilding. But for the Labour Party, more importantly, this election leaves questions about policy, questions about how will they get the buy-in of the British people who have, for the majority, not given their support to the Labour Party. That must be emphasized. What we have here are the results and the machinations of a system of the first past the post, that if this system was implemented in South Africa, oh my, the results in our own elections would be very much different.
Let's look at the foreign policy for the Labour Party as Starmer now takes over as the Prime Minister. We understand that he will be attending the NATO summit that will be taking place in the US. How should we understand where Labour stands when it comes to geopolitics, especially with the 2 major wars that are playing out, one in Europe and the other one in the Middle East?
That is such a brilliant question, Eldrin, considering that, while Labour gained seats here, they also lost 6 seats. And one of those seats was related to the Hamas-Israel conflict as we face it. They've got a huge Muslim support base, particularly in the West Midlands. And so certainly for them, this is one of those foreign policy issues that will definitely be very difficult for Keir Starmer. And secondly, it comes at a time where some of his allies in NATO, and in Europe have taken decisions to accept and recognize the state of Palestine. Even Emmanuel Macron, the French president, who faces his own challenges in terms of French parliamentary elections, has recognized that perhaps it will be key to move towards a position where the Europe recognizes Palestine as a state in a bid to take the sting away from Hamas and to embolden the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO. So certainly for Britain, its interests are tied both in Europe, but certainly the conflict between the United States and China will also be a very huge factor in the way that the United Kingdom positions itself. When you consider the fact that you had in the former Prime Minister and, well, until later today, the current Foreign Secretary, David Cameron, who has really been pushing for a re-energizing of relations with China. Remember that was his flagship legacy when he was Prime Minister. Unfortunately now, with the rise of Keir Starmer, what will it mean in terms of that foreign policy question? And unfortunately, it is too early to say, but certainly the first point that he will have to make is ensure that he has strong relations with the United States, who themselves have an election coming on and whose results may in the end find the United Kingdom back to that awkward part of the relationship where you have a Labour Prime Minister and a Republican president, and in this case, a president who doesn't want to be involved in foreign affairs in the manner that other presidents had. That lays a responsibility and a consequence for British foreign policy and involvement in the globe. So it's going to be interesting times for South Africa and its government. The key focus must be to again revitalize the relations with the United Kingdom. They are a close and dear trade and investment partner. But secondly, given where growth, economic growth seems to be coming from in terms of the South African economy, the United Kingdom holds expertise in those areas. And so having a person in the form of the party of the Democratic Alliance in the room may be an opportunity for South Africa and the United Kingdom to find each other, particularly on hard questions such as Zimbabwe, where that crisis continues to continue.
Yeah, well, Labour, as an example, wouldn't have the same stance that the Democratic Alliance have, for instance, when it comes to geopolitics and what is playing out, especially in the Middle East. David Lemmy, who is the shadow minister for the Labour Party, had said before that the UK needs a refreshed foreign policy based on progressive realism. And when we look at the continent, South Africa being one of the biggest trading partners for the UK on the continent, and the UK being South Africa's being amongst the 5 top trading partners that South Africa has, what does this mean economically speaking, and also that shift away from countries on the continent being seen as going to the West with begging bowls?
Well, certainly one of the leading, sort of discussions that have happened in the United Kingdom in the past 5 years is certainly how does the country re-envision its relationship with the global South. And particularly when Brexit happened, one of the arguments made by the proponents of Brexit at the time was that by leaving the European Union, it would give the United Kingdom an opportunity to re-establish closer links with the Commonwealth, particularly focusing with those countries such as India and Nigeria that have such seismic populations and by implication whose economies would really matter in terms of being a market for trade and investment. Certainly, South Africa becomes an important country in that conversation, not from a population perspective, but certainly from the fact that we are the largest economy on the continent. We are, in terms of the financial sector, far ahead than any other country, given even the fact that the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, by market capitalization, is the biggest in the continent and top 20 in the world. These two countries have a lot in which they can engage on, they can find each other on, and especially if the Labour Party brings within them that social justice element that has somewhat been missing in conservative foreign policy, it gives an opportunity for the United Kingdom to reframe the way they engage the global South as no longer countries which ought to be spoken to, but countries which they need to speak to in order to find solutions for the challenges of the world. The very fact that Africa continues to be the United Kingdom's largest feeder in terms of students, minus barring India, is a huge factor because it speaks towards how can Africa help the United Kingdom in areas where they have a skills shortage that ensure that the United Kingdom remains a competitive country. But at the same time, given the legacy of the education connection between Africa and the United Kingdom, there's more work that can be done, particularly in collaboration with our own universities, particularly in collaboration with our own governments, to say, how can the students who study in the United Kingdom be brought back into the system in Africa in order to help develop the continent? And that will boost the soft power of the United Kingdom, but also its credibility in winning over African nations. Because if there's one thing the Russian-Ukraine conflict has taught us, is that the West is losing on messaging, particularly in a continent like Africa. And so the United Kingdom, this is an opportunity for it to recalibrate, rebrand its relationship with the continent.
A very interesting one. I wonder whether there will be a revision of the decision that was taken to introduce visas for South Africans wanting to travel to the UK. But thank you so much for your time. Musa Mdunge there joining us from the University of Dundee. And this is on the victory of the Labour Party in the UK polls.